Welcome, everybody, to the Ishtar Channel podcast. We've got a really interesting conversation to have and for you to listen to today. We are going to come together and talk about the 5 stories of mankind and how those 5 stories play into the growth and the evolution, the soul's journey, ultimately the soul's journey of growth and evolution. So I'm going to ask Ishtar to give us a little overview and also share with us the council and the master that shared these 5 stories with her, because it came through in a channel. If any of you are students of the Path of the One Heart, then depending on what your mission work is, you'll be very acquainted with the 5 stories, because that's also what comes up in our training, in our mission work for the scribes and for the lawmakers in particular. But it's a very, it's wisdom that can really give you a deep understanding about yourself, about the journey of the soul, the many initiations the soul is going to walk through based on which story they are in and where they are on that journey. So I'm going to ask Ishtar now to give us a little overview. Why the stories of mankind? Why only 5? And given how many stories and narratives we're so good at creating for ourselves, and that's one thing that you will learn, how they all can be distilled down into one of these 5 stories. So Ishtar, your time to share.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. This channel came through in 2018 from Lord Maitreya, and he talked about the 5 original stories of mankind. He basically said that, we have a journey of running through these stories that we've created through our experiences. And of course, we run millions and trillions of stories through the collective of humanity. And all of them, though he's saying, all come from a base consciousness, if you will, of what we've created from an experience that we've had as a collective group. And that, he says that, our stories come from many places, from our parents, from our ancestors, from our peer groups, from the collective consciousness, and through our experiences and what we've created from those experiences. But he tries to, what he says to us is that we are not our stories. And what he's saying is that humanity believes we are our stories. We live these stories and we replay them again and again, believing that they're our truth, when in fact they're not our truth. And these 5 stories, the original stories of mankind, really relate to a journey that the soul is on as it comes into the physical world. And then it gets caught up in the consciousness that it creates around that. And how much we love our stories. He talks about how much humanity loves our stories. And what happens when we're in our stories, we're no longer in the present. We're no longer in the now. We're no longer in the present moment. But we're living through the attachment to whatever we've created through the experiences we've had on our journey. And what he says is that often these stories become great burdens and responsibilities that we carry with us, and they drain us of our energy, and it makes it very difficult to live in the present moment, because we're so often living through the past, or through the fear of the future, or even the need to create the future through these stories that we're running. So he wants us to realize that these stories are not really our truth, that they're simply something that we've created based on what we have experienced. So let me just quickly have a little bit of a quick overview of these 5 stories, Joe. He says to you that these stories can cause you to remain in struggle and limitation in your life, or your stories will bring you fully into the present, into the now, and where you'll meet your truth, your original blueprint, and not the distortion of the blueprint, not the distortion of who you are, and where you can actually meet your potential. And while you're trapped in these stories, you're not meeting your potential, you're sitting in limitation. So the journey is, when we first come into a physical body on the earth, or anywhere else for that matter, we're birthed out of the womb of source. So it's like this big voidal consciousness, which is the consciousness of thought, and we get birthed from that into the physical. And of course, that can be pretty shocking. Just like any physical birth, being birthed from the physical mother, we come into, we're coming out of the womb and coming into a place where we've suddenly got to breathe air. We're being, hit with lights and all sorts of energy that we're not used to. And it causes us to cry out, to scream. It's the same sort of birthing. And it can be very disruptive for the soul to be suddenly birthed into this physical environment that it may have memories of that were not very pleasant, or simply just being in the physical. It can be very distracting, disheartening, can be challenging. And so that first sort of story of arrival, when we actually feel that separation from the consciousness of source, from the womb of source, it's the same energy as when we feel that separation from the womb of the physical mother. And so what can happen is that we often feel that we're no longer supported, we're no longer being nourished by the source energy. We feel that we're suddenly cast out into this physical environment on our own, and we have no connection anymore. We don't feel that connection that we had before. We don't feel safe anymore. So, and what we want to do is we want to crawl back in. We want to get back. We don't want to come out into this. We want to go back. And that can be a very disruptive energy for us to carry with us into our life. And what happens is that we feel the loss. We feel the loss of that support, that nourishment, that love, that connection. And when we feel that, it creates such a limitation on us. So if we're living through that story of loss, of disconnection, of separation, it's a very, very big energy to be carrying with us. And so what we tend to do is we then begin to look for that source energy. How do we get back? How do we get that energy back? How do we go back into the womb? How do we get that connection back? So it begins a whole journey of wanting to reconnect. And that's sort of the first story, the first energy that becomes the base for so many actions, so many manifestations, so many beliefs, so much consciousness that humanity can run. And you can just imagine all the different variations that we create from that one experience and consciousness that we create, and the limitations that can create for us.
So I have a question. I'm just putting myself in the shoes of those who have perhaps never heard of the 5 original stories of mankind. And one question that might come up for them is, are the stories linear? Are you born as a soul into the physical planes of existence, and do you move through each of them in a linear manner? Can you skip story 1 and find yourself in story 2 or story 3? Or do you actually have to move through, like we have to be birthed? We have to come out of the womb.
That's right.
And so is it automatic that we will all have resonance to some thread of narrative in that first story?
My understanding is that in our first birthing, yes, because we're seeking that reconnection. Every soul is going to be different in how they respond to that disconnection, if you will, because there is no disconnection in truth, but we create that idea of disconnection from coming out of the womb. And it depends on each soul. So my understanding is that, yes, we do sort of move in a linear way, but what we create from that, we will create many different versions on that one basic energy, one basic consciousness. So we're going to look at that, and we know that we incarnate numerous times. So every time you come back into the physical body, are you going to repeat that separation energy? Well, it's up to you, the soul, of what you've created and where you've moved to. And if you've stayed in that story and haven't moved out of that fear of separation and loss and disconnection, well, then you're going to come back into that, because it's sitting in your consciousness, and you're going to create other versions of it. So what does that mean, to create other versions? Well, just let your mind imagine you're sitting here feeling disconnected. So often you will create that disconnection with your own mother or your own parents, or you'll feel unloved and unsupported by family. You may feel unloved and supported by the human collective. You can create many, many stories around that. You may feel totally alone, and you're the only person on the earth and no one's there for you. You can create all these different stories. Or you may also feel that there's this beautiful womb energy of source that is there, and you'd like to go back to it. So you're going to create this consciousness or story of seeking it out. How do I find it? Where do I go for it? What do I need to do to reconnect with that? And if you've done numerous incarnations and you've worked on that, you might get birthed and discover that you have made that connection and it's with you. So even in this new incarnation, you have never lost that connection. So you feel completely connected. And so you will move through, but you will probably move through these 5 stories in some way to get to that place of feeling that you are completely connected and not alone and disconnected. I feel too that the Maitreya really shared this with us, because this is a collective flow, a collective consciousness. It's about the whole story of humanity itself and where it's at on a collective level, not so much on a personal level, but certainly you can all relate to this feeling and where you're at as we move through, definitely.
And I think what you speak to there really helps us understand why one infant, one child can feel very, very loved, very connected, very attached into the family that they have been birthed into, and allow themselves to receive that connection, versus another child that still holds, as you said, what they've created within that story, and perhaps still holds the unresolved karma of not feeling connected to source. And so when that child is born, they have the perfect parent, perfect family, perfect unit that's going to mirror back to them their perspective, their unconscious belief that they're not loved, not wanted, not seen, not heard. And so here I'm also seeing a beautiful correlation to the developing psyche of the inner child. What contributes, the consciousness that contributes to that developing psyche of the inner child, which of course is that program that they've brought in. And depending on if that's been resolved or not, will greatly determine the experience they have of their childhood and the experience that they attract within that time of early childhood, 0 to 7. Would that be true? I'm sort of seeing a correlation there to a lot of what we talk about around inner child.
Definitely, Jo, definitely. That's very true. So correct. Because, the child self is still the soul self. We're still so connected to our souls. and all the stories and all the incarnations that we've had, and the past 3 live or incarnations that we've lived, the child is very connected to right up to about the age of 6 or 7. So that whatever you have created in those lifetimes will certainly play out for you as a child, which is why in families, as you said, you can have 2 or 3 or 4 children, and each one of them will have a whole different way of approaching their connection to their family.
Mm. So where do we then go? That's the first original story, the perception of connection or disconnection
That's
to
right.
source. Where do we go? What does that then give birth into the next story?
Well, the next story really gives birth to that feeling of we're trying to find out why we feel so disconnected, why we feel this, we don't feel that connection, or why we do feel it. So if we feel that connection, we feel the love, we feel, our heart's full, we're supported, we're held. When we don't feel that connection, then we can often feel very disempowered. We feel very limited. Why are we not connected? Why don't they love us? What we're really asking is, why doesn't Source love us? Why doesn't God love us? And and then we feel that we're not good enough, or that we've been cast out from heaven. This is where this religious connotation comes from as well. And it's a very big religious story, because the first story, religion also will tell us that we aren't really connected directly to Source, that we can only be connected through a priest or through somebody in the higher hierarchy of a church or some religion that can connect us, a rabbi or whatever. We can't do it ourselves. And then, then we're told by religions that we're not good enough, that we're sinners, and we've been cast out of heaven. And so that just really builds on this story of being disempowered, of not being connected. And so it's so easy to fall into that. And also, Maitreya said that it's in this area that we sort of come into our will, our free will, where we begin to see that we have got some power through our ego, that we can make choices through our free will, and that, we can choose to either flow with the divine plan that says that we are a divine being and that we are connected to Source, or we can choose to understand that, well, I don't understand what the divine plan's about. Why would God send us here to earth? Just to feel pain and suffering? What is that about? And so we go into that whole thing. Well, we must be bad. We must be sinners. We must be not good enough for God, that God has sent us here. And so when we do that, we become the victim of Source. We become the victim of God. So it's so important for us to not become that, because what happens is that when we become the victim of God or the victim of Source, we become the victim of everything, and we feel we haven't got any power. So we create a big resistance to whatever we feel is disempowering us. And so firstly, we feel God's disempowered us, and so we have this, we're so much less than God. Then everybody around us who has any authority disavows us, so we become so much less than them. We feel that we're smaller. And so what happens then is we begin to build up resistance, a resistance to the God energy, to the authority energy, to the energy that is bigger than us. So once again, we become even more disconnected. So we can either do that, or we can become even more connected and understand that the divine plan is about souls coming into the physical and learning through the physical. So we have a choice here. Which story are we going to go with? Are we going to go with the aligned story of the divine plan, or are we going to go with the other story, which makes us a victim and disempowers us and tells us we don't have any connection, we're not good enough to have that connection? So anybody or anything that has authority over us makes us a victim. And so we then go into a huge lot of resistance. And this speaks a lot to where humanity's running at the moment, this resistance to whatever's bigger than us, in some way that makes us feel small, so we believe. Yet if we were actually in our power, we would never feel small. If we felt we were very connected, we wouldn't feel small. but we do feel the victim. We're the victim of everything that's bigger than us. And so that becomes the second story. And you can see how limiting that can be, particularly on a collective consciousness.
Mm. Well, one of the things that you shared within that, which I think is a real key to come into an understanding for, is how we unconsciously replace parents, carers, anyone in a place of authority. We replace that person into what we don't realize is our image of God. That image of source. We don't consciously think to ourselves, oh, it's God I'm feeling disconnected to.
Mm.
We're there thinking, oh, it's mum or it's dad I'm feeling disconnected to, or it's, whoever is representing somebody that you are wanting to have a feeling of connection, especially as a child, to fulfill that sense of safety and security that we seek for through connection as a young child. And so I find that really fascinating that that's part of one of our key learnings as a soul as we evolve, to realize what is that connection that we're really looking for, because we've gone and replaced it with a person, thinking the person is the connection we're looking for, when in actual fact it's really with our own spirit, with God's source energy that's within us. So I feel that that's a real key of wisdom there, to come and realize those two pieces and place them appropriately in the puzzle of the soul's journey. And something else that you shared as well that really comes back again to the evolution of the inner child and the development of that early infant into the adolescent, where that resistance, feeling disconnected, and then, as you said, manifesting often through the resistance or feeling of disconnectedness, that becomes what causes us to push those that we love away from us, and we become the rebel as the adolescent, child growing up, and we don't realize we're doing it to ourselves.
Yes.
That's, I think that's the hardest thing. We feel like it, because it's all part of the victim energy you're speaking to. We think it's being done to us. That others are pushing us away, and others don't understand us, and others don't want to connect. Where in actual fact we're doing it from that place of unconscious victim energy. So yeah, those two things I think are vital for us to understand in this journey, and you've spoken to it really beautifully.
Oh, thank you, Joe. And I think it's really important to understand that it's not even just people that we want to have that connection with, but that we sort of, it's all about God, but in the end we reach out to people or we reject people. But it's also about consumerism. It could be about power. It could be about money. It's about wanting, having, and filling ourselves up with something, that because we feel we're so empty and we don't have that power within us. So we're seeking something, and then we get really angry when we're not feeling it. We can have as much money as we can like, we can be Elon Musk with all that money, and yet really angry that we're still empty inside, and so we act out on that anger, and we reject and push and push things away from us in our resistance to the understanding of what we're really upset about is our disconnection. And that's so true. And we act out on that. And that anger can be, taking things out on everybody. And that comes down to that victim that feels so angry with themselves for having that disconnection, with others for allowing it, or, mirroring it to them, and not understanding what they need to do to make that connection real for them. And so they just act out, as you said. And that's very, very sad.
Yes, absolutely. And not understanding, as you say, not really understanding what it is that they're actually looking for. They're, as you said, they're looking for a sense of power, which is their distorted understanding of what power is when you seek it through materialism, money, status, labels, etc. And if we could only just stop and take a breath and really ask ourselves, what is it that we're really seeking when we're driven to consumerism, when we're driven, beyond what is necessary to meet our needs at a physical level? What then continues to drive that consumerism? And I'm hoping anybody who's listening to this may just start to question and self-reflect and ask themselves, if this feels like you, if you feel like there's a void, a gap that you're looking to fill, then perhaps you're starting to realize that this gap that you're looking to fill is actually this connection you've always been looking for and seeking, but haven't realized it until right now in this moment. And if that's you, then I'm hoping that you can start to see that your seeking isn't wrong. It's not inappropriate. It's part of the journey you're on.
Yes. Yeah.
But to come into a deeper understanding of that which it is that you're seeking, so that we can help guide you to make more fulfilling choices than the emptiness of materialism.
Definitely.
So from there, we've got 5 stories to get through. We've got through 2. Do we go to the third, or do we do the third in a part 2?
I think we do part 2. Let's just leave it for a minute for everyone to reflect, and just to understand that, when we're talking about the second story, it's about the soul coming into the will of the human self. So what they're choosing to, either through their disconnection, through their seeking, their need for power, to feel that power, and where they're seeking that power, whether it's they're coming back to spirit to seek that power, understanding that this is, flowing with spirit is going to give them the power they're really looking for, or whether their will is driving them to such a state that the power comes from what's outside of them, from money, from control, from status, from image, from all of those things which they believe gives them power. And of course, it gives them control, yes, but does it give them the power that they're really looking for? No. So their pain and suffering doesn't stop, because they're still sitting in that victim energy. And, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, or how much power you've got over others, how much control you've got over others. It's never going to fill you in what you're really looking for.
So I hope you've enjoyed the introduction to the 5 original stories of mankind. We have given you an overview and introduced you to the first 2. So we really hope you come and tune into our next podcast for part 2 of the original stories of mankind, where we will go through story 3, story 4, and story 5. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ishtar. Can't wait for the next one.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to everyone for being on the journey with us. Thank you so much. Blessings, everyone. Blessings.